When she said the words, "Sorry, I'm in a wheelchair," the air in the room usually shifted. People shifted their weight. They tilted their heads, adopting that sickening, soft focus look of performative pity. Victoria hated that look. She's expected it, but she hated it. Arturo, however, didn't do any of that. He didn't blink. He didn't apologize for her reality. He just looked at the 6-inch concrete step blocking her path, then looked back at her, deadpan. "Okay. And I'm wearing boots. Are we listing obvious facts, or are we going to figure out how to look at these blueprints?" That was the exact second the ice cracked. Arturo wiped a smear of wood glue from the heel of his hand, staring at the overdue electric bill pinned to the refrigerator. It was 5:30 in the morning. The kitchen was quiet, save for the hum of the dying compressor in the fridge and the rhythmic, soft breathing of his 7-year-old daughter, Chloe, asleep on the worn living room sofa. He hadn't meant for her to sleep there, but she had a fever the night before, and the couch was closer to the only working window AC unit in the apartment. Arturo took a sip of his coffee. It was lukewarm and tasted like copper and burnt grounds. He swallowed it anyway. He was 34, but his knees felt 50, and his hands looked older still. Calloused, scarred, permanently stained with dark walnut stain in the creases of his knuckles. He was a master carpenter, an artisan in a world that increasingly preferred flat-pack furniture and cheap veneers. He survived on high-end custom jobs, the kind commissioned by people who had more money than God and twice the demands. Today's job was one of those. A massive library renovation in a sprawling estate up in the hills overlooking the city. The pay would clear his debts, cover Chloe's upcoming dental work, and give him 3 months of breathing room, if he didn't screw it up. "Dad?" Arturo turned. Chloe was sitting up, rubbing her eyes, her wild blonde hair sticking up in gravity-defying cowlicks. "Hey, kiddo, how's the head?" he asked, crossing the room and pressing the back of his hand to her forehead. Cool. The fever had broken. "I'm okay. Can I go to school?" Arturo hesitated. Mrs. Higgins, his usual backup babysitter, had called out sick yesterday. He couldn't afford to miss this walkthrough, but he also couldn't send a freshly recovered 7-year-old to a germ factory classroom. "Not today, Bug. You're coming to work with me. Grab your sketchbook and the good markers." An hour later, Arturo's battered Ford truck was grinding its way up a steep, winding driveway lined with perfectly manicured weeping willows. The estate was a monolithic structure of glass, steel, and dark stone. It looked less like a home and more like a modern art museum. It was cold, imposing, and reeked of the kind of wealth that didn't need to shout to be heard. He parked near the service entrance, helped Chloe out, and handed her her backpack. "Rules of the rich house," he said, holding up a finger. "Don't touch the walls, don't touch the art, speak only when spoken to, and if anyone asks, I'm your unpaid intern," Chloe recited perfectly. Deadpan. Arturo smirked. "Close enough. Just stay close to me." They walked through a labyrinth of marble hallways until they reached the west wing. The space that was meant to be the library was currently a gutted cavern of exposed brick and temporary scaffolding. Dust motes danced in the harsh beams of morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. In the center of the room, behind a massive, raw-edge oak table piled high with blueprints, sat a woman. Arturo didn't immediately register the wheelchair. The table obscured the lower half of her body. What he noticed first was her posture. It was rigid, authoritative. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer over a crisp white shirt, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, sleek knot at the nape of her neck. She was on the phone, her voice a low, modulated hum of pure, concentrated power. "I don't care if the Port Authority is stalling, David. Route the shipments through the northern hub. If they push back, Remind them who holds the lease on their primary warehouse. Get it done." She tapped a button on her earpiece, ending the call, and finally looked up. Her eyes were a striking, piercing gray. They swept over Arturo's dusty boots, his worn denim, and finally landed on Chloe, who was currently trying to peel a piece of dried glue off her thumb. "You're the carpenter," she said. It wasn't a question. "Arturo Miller," he replied, stepping forward and extending a hand. "Custom Woodworks. This is my daughter, Chloe. Childcare fell through. She won't be in the way." The woman looked at his extended hand for a fraction of a second before taking it. Her grip was firm, cold. "Victoria Hayes. And I sincerely hope she won't be, Mr. Miller. I'm running a corporation from my dining room while this house is being rebuilt. I don't have time for distractions." Arturo withdrew his hand. "Victoria Hayes, CEO of Hayes Global Freight, a self-made billionaire before 35, known in the financial columns for being brilliant, ruthless, and intensely private. She's quieter than the dust, Ms. Hayes. Where do you want to start?" Victoria gestured to their blueprints. "The shelving on the east wall. The architect designed them to be 14 feet high, with a rolling ladder system. I need them redesigned." Arturo frowned, stepping up to the table and looking over the schematics. 14 feet standard for a room with this ceiling height. A rolling ladder makes the upper tiers entirely accessible. If we drop the height, you'll ruin the vertical symmetry of the room. It'll look squat." "I don't care about the vertical symmetry," Victoria said sharply. "I care about functionality." "A rolling ladder is functional," Arturo argued, his professional pride bristling. He wasn't just a hammer swinger, he was a craftsman. He hated bad design. "Look, if it's a safety concern, I can widen the treads on the ladder, put in a heavy-duty locking mechanism." "Mr. Miller," she interrupted, her voice dropping a register, icing over. She pushed herself back from the table. The smooth, silent motors of her customized titanium wheelchair engaged, pulling her out from behind the oak slab into the clear morning light. Arturo stopped talking. Victoria stared at him, her chin tilted up, bracing for the inevitable shift in his demeanor. It was a defense mechanism she had honed over 5 years. Ever since the accident that severed her spine at the T8 vertebra, she had watched people change when they saw the chair. They got soft. They stuttered. They suddenly treated her like she was made of spun glass instead of steel. "Sorry, I'm in a wheelchair," Victoria said. The words were clipped, laced with a bitter, preemptive strike of sarcasm. "Unless you plan on installing an elevator track on those 14-foot shelves, a rolling ladder isn't going to do me much good. Redesign them." The silence in the gutted room stretched, thick and heavy with dust. Victoria kept her eyes locked on Arturo, waiting for the stumble. She waited for the flush of embarrassment to creep up his neck, for the stammered apologies, the sudden, overly accommodating tone that drove her absolutely insane. Arturo looked at the chair. He looked at the heavy, off-road wheels, the sleek black frame, the way her legs were positioned perfectly still on the footrests. Then, he looked back at the blueprints. He didn't apologize. He didn't flush. "Okay," Arturo said, picking up a thick carpenter's pencil. "And I'm wearing boots. Are we listing obvious facts, or are we going to figure out how to look at these blueprints from a lower angle?" Victoria blinked. It was a minute, almost imperceptible break in her armor. "Excuse me? You said you wanted functionality," Arturo said, his voice entirely devoid of pity or awkwardness. It was just a problem to be solved, no different than a warped joist or a crooked wall. "Dropping the shelves to eye level for you will leave 8 feet of blank drywall above them. It's going to look like a waiting room at a dentist's office. You're paying me for a custom library, not a waiting room." "I am paying you to build what I tell you to build," Victoria snapped, though the heat had left her voice. She was genuinely thrown off balance. "You're paying me to build it right," Arturo countered. He tapped the pencil against his thigh. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the scaffolding. the temporary support beams, the piles of raw materials. What if we build a mezzanine? A what? A wraparound mezzanine level. We split the difference. 7-foot shelves on the ground floor. A heavy, suspended walkway jutting out from the wall, with a gentle, graded ramp wrapping around the back of the room behind the fireplace structure. Gives you full access to the upper level. No ladders. You keep the vertical symmetry, you get access to every single book, and it makes the room look like it belongs in a billionaire's house, not a basement. Victoria stared at him. She looked at the raw sketch he was rapidly scrawling over the expensive architect's blueprints. It was rough, but she could see the vision. It was brilliant. It was also an engineering nightmare. The structural load of a suspended mezzanine, she started, her analytical mind immediately kicking in. Would require steel reinforcements tied directly into the masonry, which is already exposed, Arturo pointed out, gesturing to the bare brick. I can hide the steel with a false wood veneer, oak, to match the lower cabinetry. It'll cost you 20% more and add a week to the timeline. He finally looked up from the paper, meeting her cold gray eyes with his tired brown ones. Unless you just want the dentist's office. A slow, reluctant smirk tugged at the corner of Victoria's mouth. It was the first time she had smiled all week. You're incredibly arrogant for a man wearing a shirt with a hole in the collar, Mr. Miller. I'm a good carpenter, Mrs. Hayes. My laundry skills are secondary. Dad, a small voice piped up. Arturo and Victoria both turned. Chloe had wandered over to the sunken seating area in the center of the room. It was a circular pit, designed to eventually hold couches around a fire pit, but right now it was a concrete depression 3 feet deep, accessed by a short flight of 3 steep, temporary wooden stairs. I dropped my blue marker down there, Chloe said, pointing into the pit. I'll get it in a second, Bug, Arturo said, turning back to the blueprints. Actually, Victoria said, her voice dropping back to its cool, professional register. I need to inspect the moisture barrier in that pit. The project manager said there was pooling after the rain yesterday. We need to go down there. Arturo looked at the pit. Then he looked at the 3 steep, uneven, temporary wooden stairs. There was no handrail. It was barely safe for him to walk down, let alone a wheelchair. Victoria saw him calculating. Here it comes, she thought. The awkward pause, the realization of her limitations, the moment where the man takes charge and tells her to stay put while he does the physical work. It exhausted her. Arturo didn't say a word. He walked over to a stack of heavy-duty, reinforced plywood leaning against the wall. He grabbed a massive 8x4 sheet, his biceps straining under the weight, and hauled it over to the pit. He dropped it over the stairs, creating a steep but smooth decline. He didn't offer to push her. He didn't ask if she needed help. He simply walked over to his tool bag, pulled out 2 heavy iron C-clamps, and bolted the top of the plywood securely to the concrete lip so it wouldn't slide. He stood up, dusted off his hands, and walked down the makeshift ramp, retrieving Chloe's blue marker on the way. He tossed the marker up to his daughter, then turned back to Victoria, standing at the bottom of the pit. Moisture barrier looks intact from over here, he called up to her casually. But you're the boss. Come take a look. Victoria gripped the joystick of her chair. Her knuckles were white. No one treated her like this. They either babied her, or they ignored the logistical nightmares of her existence entirely, leaving her stranded. Arturo did neither. He saw the barrier, dismantled it, and then expected her to carry on as normal. She eased the joystick forward. The heavy chair rolled onto the plywood. The decline was steep, and gravity immediately grabbed the chair, threatening to send her hurtling downward. Victoria tensed, ready to break, but as she rolled down, she felt a sudden, steadying weight on the front frame of her chair. Arturo hadn't made a show of it. He had simply stepped forward, planted his heavy work boots into the concrete, and casually rested one massive hand on the lower metal bar of her footrest, acting as a human brake, slowing her descent to a manageable, gentle roll. He wasn't looking at her as if he was saving her. He was looking at the concrete floor. When she reached the bottom, he let go, stepped back, and pointed at the corner. "See? Dry as a bone." Victoria looked at the dry concrete. Her chest felt strangely tight. "Yes," she managed to say quietly. "Dry." By noon, the estate was stiflingly hot. The AC had been shut off for the demolition crew, and the summer sun was baking the glass walls of the library. Arturo was sweating through his shirt, his tape measure a permanent fixture in his right hand, as he marked out the anchor points for the new mezzanine he had essentially bullied the billionaire into approving. Victoria hadn't left. She had moved her impromptu desk setup to the far corner of the room, her laptop balanced on her knees, her phone practically fused to her ear. She was firing people, hiring people, and moving millions of dollars in freight while Arturo drilled into masonry. It was a bizarre choreography. Chloe, meanwhile, had grown bored of her markers. She had spent the last 20 minutes quietly edging closer and closer to Victoria, her large, observant eyes locked on the sleek machinery of the wheelchair. Arturo saw this happening out of the corner of his eye and froze. "Chloe," he warned, his voice a low, sharp bark. "Give Ms. Hayes her space. She's working." Victoria held up a hand, silencing the executive on the other end of her phone. "I'll call you back, Greg. The union demands are ridiculous. Counter with a 4% bump and tell them to walk if they don't like it." She hung up, tossing the phone onto the table. She looked down at the 7-year-old standing 3 feet away. "It's fine, Mr. Miller," Victoria said. She looked at Chloe. "You're staring at the wheels. Are you an engineer like your father?" "My dad builds stuff. He's not an engineer. Engineers do math, Dad does magic," Chloe said matter-of-factly. Arturo barked a laugh, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. "I'll remind you of that when you want a pony, kid." Chloe ignored him, stepping closer to Victoria. "Is it fast?" "Chloe," Arturo warned again, stepping down from his stepladder. "You didn't ask a billionaire about her disability. It was a social landmine." "Arturo, let her ask," Victoria said, using his first name for the first time. It felt strange in her mouth, less corporate, more human. She turned her attention back to the girl. "It's moderately fast. It goes about 6 miles an hour on flat ground." "Can you do a wheelie?" Victoria actually laughed. It was a rusty, unused sound that echoed strangely in the large room. "No. The battery pack is in the front. It weighs 80 pounds to prevent exactly that from happening." "Why do you need it?" Chloe asked, tilting her head. The innocence of the question hung in the air, blunt and unpolished. Arturo winced. He stepped forward, grabbing a rag from his back pocket. "All right, Bug. That's enough 20 questions. Time for my union-mandated coffee break." He looked at Victoria, an apology finally forming in his eyes. "Sorry. She doesn't have a filter yet." "Don't apologize for her curiosity. It's better than adults who stare and whisper," Victoria said. She looked at Chloe. "I was in a car accident a long time ago. A truck hit my car. My spine got broken, so my brain can't send messages to my legs anymore to tell them to move. So the chair moves for me." Chloe absorbed this information with the profound, terrifying pragmatism only children possess. "Oh, does it hurt?" "Sometimes," Victoria answered honestly. "Mostly it's just annoying. Like when Dad's back hurts and he groans when he stands up." "Exactly like that," Arturo sighed, shaking his head, though a small smile played on his lips. He walked over to a battered red Coleman cooler he had brought in, popping the lid. He pulled out a large, dented metal thermos and 2 mismatched ceramic mugs. "I was going to offer you a cup of coffee, Ms. Hayes, but after my daughter just roasted my advanced age, I feel like I should be offering you an apology instead," Arturo said. He poured the steaming, dark liquid into the mugs. Victoria looked at the chipped mug he held out to her. In her world, coffee was served in porcelain, brought by an assistant, and usually cost more than Arturo made in an hour. She took the mug. It was scalding hot, black, and smelled like chicory and gasoline. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her cold hands around the warm ceramic. Arturo sat down on a stack of drywall across from her. He looked exhausted. The bravado he had shown while arguing about the blueprints was gone, replaced by the bone-deep weariness of a single parent trying to keep his head above water. "She's a good kid," Victoria noted, taking a sip of the coffee. It was surprisingly good, strong enough to wake the dead. "She's the best thing I've ever done," Arturo said quietly, watching Chloe set up a makeshift camp for her action figures in a pile of sawdust across the room. "And the hardest?" Victoria studied him. "Where's her mother?" The question was direct, overstepping professional boundaries. But Arturo had dismantled those boundaries the moment he built that ramp. "Gone," Arturo said flatly. "Packed her bags when Chloe was 2. Said she wasn't built for a blue-collar life in a 2-bedroom apartment. Haven't seen her since." He took a long drag of his coffee, his eyes dark. "It's just me and the bug." Victoria felt a strange pang in her chest. She was surrounded by people constantly: assistants, board members, physical therapists, lawyers. And yet, looking at this dusty carpenter on a stack of drywall, she felt a profound sense of recognition. "It's exhausting, isn't it?" Victoria asked softly. Arturo looked up, surprised by the tone of her voice. "Being a single dad?" "No," Victoria said, looking down at the titanium rim of her wheel. "Having to be the strong one all this time. Having everyone rely on you to hold the structure up, and knowing if you crack, the whole damn thing comes down." Arturo stared at her. The billionaire CEO and the hourly carpenter. 2 people living in entirely different stratospheres, tethered to the ground by entirely different anchors. "Yeah," Arturo breathed, the word carrying years of unspoken weight. "Yeah, it is." He didn't say anything else. He didn't offer a platitude. He just reached out, tapped his chipped ceramic mug against hers, and drank his coffee. For the first time in 5 years, sitting in the dust and the heat of a gutted room, Victoria felt like she was finally on level ground. 3 weeks bled into 4. The skeletal frame of the library began to wear its skin. Heavy oak paneling replaced exposed brick. The scent of raw timber, sawdust, and strong coffee became the permanent atmosphere of the West Wing. And Victoria Hayes never went back to her corporate headquarters. She told her executive assistant it was to keep an eye on the contractors. She told her board of directors it was a logistical necessity due to temporary server migrations. Both were lies. She stayed because her office was sterile, quiet, and dead. The library was loud, chaotic, and alive. Specifically, it was alive with the rhythmic thud of a framing hammer and the off-key humming of a 7-year-old girl. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The summer heat was oppressive, pressing against the massive glass windows like a physical weight. Arturo was elevated on a scissor lift, wrestling a 12-foot section of the false wood veneer into place along the steel underbelly of the mezzanine. Sweat soaked through his gray t-shirt. His muscles corded and jumped as he held the heavy material with one shoulder, blindly reaching for his pneumatic nail gun. Victoria sat below, 30 feet away, watching him over the top of a quarterly earnings report. She shouldn't be watching him. She had a company to run. Yet her eyes kept drifting to the raw, mechanical efficiency of his movements. In her world, problems were solved with millions of dollars, lawyers, and aggressive negotiations. In Arturo's world, problems were solved with leverage, geometry, and brute force. There was an honesty to it that fascinated her. "Dad, you're doing it crooked," Chloe was sitting cross-legged on a canvas drop cloth, a massive sketchbook resting on her knees. Arturo grunted, firing 3 rapid shots from the nail gun. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound echoed like gunfire. "It's not crooked, Bug. It's following the grade of the ceiling. The ceiling is crooked." "Looks crooked to me," Chloe muttered, returning her attention to her drawing. Victoria suppressed a smile. She rolled her chair over the plywood pathways Arturo had meticulously laid down over the unfinished floors, ensuring she had unhindered access to every corner of the room. He hadn't asked if she needed them. He had simply built them, arriving 3 hours early on a Sunday to lay them down before she woke up. She stopped beside Chloe's drop cloth. "May I see?" Chloe looked up, then flipped the sketchbook around. It was a chaotic, graphite-smudged rendering of the library. It wasn't perfect, but the perspective was startlingly accurate. She had even drawn the mezzanine, complete with the sweeping, gentle curve of the ramp Arturo was currently building. "You have an eye for spatial reasoning," Victoria noted. "Dad says I have an eye for trouble," Chloe corrected. She sighed, tapping her blunt, cheap number 2 pencil against the paper. "I can't get the shading right on the wood. It just looks like gray mud." Victoria reached into the pocket of her tailored blazer. She pulled out a sleek, matte black metal tin and handed it to the girl. "Try these." Chloe opened the tin. Inside lay a pristine set of professional-grade architect's pencils, ranging from the hardest 9H to the softest 9B, nestled in black velvet. Chloe gasped, her fingers hovering over them as if they were made of glass. "Ms. Hayes," Arturo's voice drifted down from the lift. It held a warning edge. The machine hummed as he lowered himself to the ground, stepping off and wiping his hands on a rag. He walked over, his eyes fixed on the expensive tin. "Those look like they cost more than my truck. Given the state of your truck, Arturo, that's not a particularly high bar," Victoria said, not breaking eye contact. She knew exactly what he was doing. His pride was flaring, the blue-collar defense mechanism kicking in against the billionaire's charity. She wasn't going to let him have this fight. "They belong to my lead architect. He left them here last week. I was going to throw them out. They're clutter." Arturo stared at her. He knew she was lying. Her architect hadn't been on site in 2 weeks. Victoria held his gaze, her expression perfectly blank. "Challenge me," her gray eyes said. "Make your daughter give back the pencils because of your ego." Arturo looked at Chloe, whose eyes were currently the size of dinner plates as she tested a 4B pencil on a scrap of paper, marveling at the rich, dark line. He sighed, the fight draining out of his shoulders. "Say thank you, Chloe," Arturo murmured. "Thank you, Ms. Hayes," Chloe chirped, already furiously shading a corner of her drawing. Arturo looked back at Victoria. "You're a terrible liar. And you're a terrible delegator. You should have 2 men helping you lift that veneer," Victoria countered smoothly. "Can't afford 'em," Arturo said bluntly. He leaned against the scaffolding, crossing his arms. He didn't try to hide his reality. "Good help costs money. Bad help costs time. I'm short on both. I can advance you the next phase payment." "No." The refusal was instant, sharp. "We stick to this contract. I don't take handouts, and I don't take advances." Victoria felt a flicker of genuine irritation. "It's not a handout, Arturo. It's a cash flow solution. It's basic business." "It's basic business in your tax bracket," he replied, his tone softening but remaining firm. "In mine, it's a slippery slope to owing someone you can't afford to owe. We stick to the contract." He turned and walked back to the scissor lift. Victoria watched his broad back, a mixture of frustration and intense, undeniable respect settling heavy in her chest. He was stubborn, he was arrogant, and he was the only person in her life who didn't want a single damn thing from her. The crisis hit on a Thursday. A massive container ship chartered by Hayes Global Freight ran aground in the Suez Canal. It was a logistical nightmare that cascaded through global supply chains within hours. Millions of dollars were bleeding out by the minute. By 7 p.m., the library was empty of workers. Only Arturo remained, installing the heavy, custom-milled iron railings along the mezzanine ramp. He was working silently, acutely aware of the storm raging below him. Victoria had been on the phone for 6 straight hours. Her voice, usually a weapon of precise calibration, was ragged. She was speaking in rapid-fire French to a maritime lawyer in Marseille, her laptop balanced precariously on her knees. Arturo paused, resting his drill against his thigh. He watched her. She looked smaller today. The tailored blazer was crumpled. Her hair, usually bound in a flawless knot, had loose strands clinging to the sweat on her neck. But it wasn't her exhaustion that made him stop. It was her legs. Her right leg, usually perfectly still, was trembling. It was a subtle vibration at first, vibrating against the aluminum footrest. Then her left leg joined. Within seconds, both legs were rigid, jerking upward in violent, involuntary muscle spasms. Victoria's hand flew down, gripping her thigh in a white-knuckled vice, desperately trying to manually force the limb down. She didn't drop the phone. She didn't break her fluent French. But her knuckles were bone-white, and her jaw was locked in silent agony. Arturo didn't hesitate. He dropped the drill. He didn't run. Running meant panic, and panic bred pity. He walked down the ramp with heavy, deliberate steps, making sure she heard his boots on the wood. He approached her from the front, entering her field of vision slowly so he wouldn't startle her. Victoria looked up, her eyes wide, flashing with a sudden, fierce vulnerability. She hated this. She hated her body's betrayals, and she hated having witnesses even more. She shook her head sharply at him. "Back off." Arturo ignored her. He crouched down in front of her chair. "Keep talking," he ordered quietly, his voice a low, steady rumble. He reached out. He didn't ask permission. He gripped her ankles with large, calloused hands. His touch was incredibly firm, grounding. He didn't try to massage the muscles. He knew enough about severe spasticity to know that could make it worse. Instead, he applied steady, immense, downward pressure, using his own body weight to force her legs to straighten against the footrests, overriding the chaotic misfiring of her damaged nerves. Victoria gasped, the air hitching in her throat, but she forced herself to keep speaking into the phone. "Déposez l'injonction immédiatement." Yes, file the injunction immediately. Arturo stayed crouched. The muscles in her legs fought him, jumping and twitching under his grip, hard as stone. It was like trying to hold down a live wire. He didn't flinch. He just held on, locking his elbows, becoming an anchor of absolute stillness. 10 minutes passed. The room was silent, save for Victoria's clipped French and the harsh sound of her breathing. Slowly, agonizingly, the spasms began to subside. The rigid muscles softened, the twitching fading into weak tremors before finally stopping entirely. Victoria ended the call. The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the floor. She slumped back against the headrest of her chair, closing her eyes. She was shaking, a cold sweat breaking out across her forehead. Arturo didn't let go immediately. He waited another full minute to ensure the spasms had truly passed. Then, he gently released her ankles, shifting his weight back onto his heels. He picked up her phone and placed it silently on the table. "Water?" he asked. Victoria kept her eyes closed. "Top drawer of the filing cabinet. There's a bottle of Bacardi. Pour it in a glass and tell me it's water." A dry chuckle escaped Arturo's chest. He stood up, his knees cracking loudly in the quiet room. He walked over to his red Coleman cooler, pulled out 2 bottles of cheap domestic beer, and twisted the caps off with the edge of his tape measure. He walked back, held one out to her. Fresh out of rum. Will a lukewarm blue-collar sedative do? Victoria opened her eyes. She looked at the bottle, then at Arturo. She took it. The glass was sweating. She took a long, unladylike swallow. It tasted like cheap hops and salvation. Autonomic dysreflexia, she said quietly, staring at the label on the bottle. Triggered by extreme stress. My nervous system panics, spikes my blood pressure, and sends my lower half into a seizure. It's embarrassing. Nothing embarrassing about a structural load limit, Arturo said, taking a swig of his own beer. He pulled up a wooden crate and sat across from her. You put too much weight on a beam, it bows. Your body is just telling you the beam is bowing. Victoria laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. My body is a broken foundation, Arturo. No, he said, his voice stripping away the cynicism, leaving only raw fact. Your body is just dealing with different physics. I watched you move 400 tons of freight across the globe while your legs were fighting you. Foundation seems pretty solid to me. Victoria looked at him. Really looked at him. He wasn't placating her. He was assessing her the same way he assessed a load-bearing wall. Why didn't you apologize? She asked softly. For what? For seeing me like that. People always apologize. I'm so sorry, Victoria. Oh, you poor thing. She mocked the sickly sweet tone perfectly. Arturo rested his forearms on his knees, turning the beer bottle in his hands. Because you didn't need pity. You needed gravity. I just provided the gravity. The silence that settled over them wasn't heavy with dust this time. It was heavy with a quiet, terrifying intimacy. The billionaire and the carpenter, sitting in the half-light of a gutted mansion, drinking cheap beer. The lines had blurred. The boundaries were gone. The mezzanine was finished. The raw oak had been sanded, stained, and sealed, glowing with a deep, rich warmth that transformed the cold, cavernous room into something approaching a sanctuary. It was Friday, final inspection day. Arturo was packing his tools. His battered canvas bag swallowed drills, clamps, and levels. He was quiet. He had been quiet all week. The job was ending, which meant the paycheck was coming, which meant he and Chloe would disappear back into the anonymity of the city, back to the two-bedroom apartment with the dying AC unit. Victoria was at her makeshift desk, ignoring an influx of emails. She felt a tight, coiled anxiety in her chest that had nothing to do with global shipping routes. She watched Arturo methodically roll up a heavy extension cord. The heavy mahogany doors to the west wing swung open. Victoria, darling, what is this apocalyptic wasteland? The voice was loud, cultured, and dripping with performative exhaustion. Richard Sterling, a senior member of her board and a man who had inherited his fortune rather than building it, strolled into the room. He wore a bespoke Italian suit and looked around the dusty floor with visible disdain. Richard, Victoria said, her spine instantly snapping straight, her tone dropping 30 degrees. You're unannounced, and you are unreachable, Richard countered, stepping carefully over a stray piece of trim. He waved a hand dismissively at the magnificent mezzanine. Is this what's keeping you from the office? Woodshop class? Arturo didn't look up. He kept wrapping the cord. Richard noticed him for the first time. He stopped, looking Arturo up and down with the kind of clinical detachment one might use to inspect a smear of mud on a tire. Excuse me. You. Arturo tied off the cord and slowly turned around. Me? Yes, you. Be a good fellow and run down to my car. Tell my driver to bring up the black leather folio from the back seat and grab a coffee from the kitchen on your way back. Richard didn't wait for an answer. He turned back to Victoria. Now, about the Suez fallout. Richard, Victoria said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a lethal razor-wire edge that made the hair on Arturo's arms stand up. She hit the joystick on her chair, rolling out from behind the desk, placing herself directly between Richard and Arturo. "You will not speak to him." Richard blinked, startled. "I was just asking the help to—" "He is not the help," Victoria snapped, her gray eyes burning with cold fire. "His name is Arturo Miller. He is a master craftsman. He is the reason this room hasn't collapsed on your empty head. And if you ever speak to him like he is a bellhop again, I will personally see to it that your shares in this company are diluted to the point of irrelevance. Am I understood?" The silence in the room was absolute. Richard's mouth opened, then closed. A dark, ugly flush crept up his neck. He looked at Victoria, then shot a venomous glare at Arturo, turned on his heel, and stalked out of the room. Victoria took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly on the armrests. She turned to Arturo, expecting a thank you, expecting a smile. Arturo's face was unreadable. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles twitched. He turned around, picked up his heavy tool bag, and slung it over his shoulder. "I'll send the final invoice to your accounting department," he said flatly. Victoria frowned, the adrenaline fading into confusion. "Arturo?" "Don't do that again," he said, his voice low, dangerously quiet. "Do what? Defend you against an arrogant prick?" "I don't need you to defend me, Victoria," Arturo fired back, his voice finally breaking its calm, echoing loudly in the finished room. He dropped the tool bag to the floor with a heavy thud. "I've dealt with guys like Richard my whole life. I know how to handle them. When you step in like that, when you throw your billions around to protect the poor little carpenter, you don't make me look strong. You emasculate me." Victoria recoiled as if she had been slapped. "That's not what I was doing. He insulted you." "He insulted my tax bracket." Arturo pointed a calloused finger at her. "Which is a gap you and I both know is sitting right in the middle of this room. You live up there," he pointed to the ceiling, "and I live down here in the dirt. I accepted that. But don't you ever patronize me by pretending you need to shield me from the reality of my own life." "I was standing up for my friend," Victoria said, her voice shaking with sudden, fierce emotion. "We aren't friends, Victoria," Arturo said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but he forced them out. He had to sever this before it ruined him. "You're the client, I'm the contractor, the job is done." He bent down, picked up his bag, and walked toward the exit. "Arturo," she called out, a desperate, raw crack in her voice. He stopped at the doorway, his back to her. "The ramp," she said, staring at the beautiful, sweeping curve of wood he had built with his own 2 hands. "You built the ramp so I wouldn't need a ladder, so we could be on the same level. Was that just part of the contract too?" Arturo closed his eyes. The weight of his reality, his debts, his fears for Chloe, crashed down on him. He gripped the strap of his bag tighter. "Yeah," Arturo lied softly into the empty air. "Just part of the contract." He walked out, leaving the billionaire alone in her perfect, accessible room. The check cleared on a Tuesday. Arturo stood in the fluorescent glare of an ATM vestibule, staring at the green numbers on the screen. The balance was more money than he had ever seen in a single place at one time. It was enough to pay off his credit cards. It was enough to cover Chloe's dental surgery out of pocket. It was enough to buy a new compressor for the truck and put 3 months of rent into a savings account. He had won. He had survived the summer. He had clawed his way out of the financial hole his ex-wife had left him in. He hit cancel, took his receipt, and felt absolutely nothing. The next day, Arturo started a new job. It was a corporate gig, outfitting a block of high-rise condos downtown with standardized flat-pack kitchens. There was no oak. There was no masonry. It was an endless sea of medium-density fiberboard, cheap laminate, and cam lock screws. It was assembly line work that required no brain, no soul, and zero craftsmanship. He hated every single second of it. The air in the condo smelled like chemical adhesive and fresh paint. He missed the smell of sawdust. He missed the sharp, demanding ring of Victoria's phone slicing through the noise of his nail gun. Most of all, he missed the terrifying, intoxicating feeling of being completely and utterly understood by someone he had no business even talking to. He got home at 6. The apartment was suffocatingly hot, despite the new, expensive window AC unit humming in the living room. "Hey, Bug," Arturo said, dropping his tool belt by the door. It hit the linoleum with a heavy, dead sound. Chloe was sitting at the tiny laminate kitchen table, hunched over her sketchbook. She didn't look up. "Mrs. Higgins made mac and cheese. It's in the fridge. She said you need to buy more milk." Arturo walked over, opening the fridge. The compressor hummed happily. It was full of groceries. Good groceries. Fresh fruit, decent meat, real cheese. He pulled out a Tupperware container, his eyes drifting to the table. Chloe was using the architect pencils. She had used them every day since Victoria had given them to her. Arturo walked over and looked over her shoulder. It was a drawing of the library. She had captured the massive windows, the sweeping curve of the mezzanine ramp, and the heavy oak shelves. But it was the figures in the center of the room that made Arturo's chest tighten. There were 3 of them: a tall man with a hammer, a small girl sitting on a drop cloth, and a woman in a chair, her lines drawn with the darkest, softest 9B pencil, making her the undeniable focal point of the entire room. "You shaded the wood, right?" Arturo said quietly, his voice raspy. "Ms. Hayes said to use the side of the lead, not the point, to make it look like grain," Chloe murmured, still shading. She stopped, tapping the pencil against the paper. "Why don't we go there anymore?" "Because the job is done, Chloe." "Did you build it wrong?" "No, I built it perfectly." Chloe frowned, looking up at him. Her eyes were far too perceptive for a 7-year-old. "Then why are you so mad all the time?" Arturo didn't have an answer. He took his cold mac and cheese, sat on the worn sofa, and ate in silence. Across the city, high up in the hills, the library was perfectly quiet. Victoria sat at the massive, raw-edge oak table. The room was a masterpiece. The lighting caught the warm tones of the wood. The mezzanine hovered above, a perfect fusion of engineering and art. The ramp swept down behind the fireplace, an elegant, seamless integration of accessibility that looked like it had been born there, not forced in as an afterthought. She had what she wanted: a perfect, functional, beautiful space. She hated it. She rolled her chair backward, the motors whining softly in the vast silence. She navigated toward the ramp, engaging the incline. The chair climbed smoothly, the tires gripping the meticulously sanded wood. When she reached the top of the mezzanine, she stopped by the railing. She reached out and ran her hand along the custom-milled iron. She could feel the faint indentations where Arturo had filed down the welds by hand, smoothing the rough edges so she wouldn't catch her fingers on them. It was a detail he hadn't billed for. It was a detail a contractor didn't do. It was a detail a man did when he cared about the hands that would touch his work. Victoria looked down at the empty concrete pit below, now perfectly leveled and tiled, ready for the expensive Italian leather sofas arriving tomorrow. "We aren't friends, Victoria. You're the client, I'm the contractor." His words echoed in her head, bouncing off the pristine walls. He had cut her down with the surgical precision of a man who knew exactly where her weak points were. He knew she was lonely. He knew she used her money as a shield, and he had refused to play the game. She pulled her phone from her pocket. She opened her banking app. She looked at the cleared transaction. Custom Woodworks, paid in full. It was a clean break. The ledger was balanced. Victoria locked the phone and threw it. It sailed across the room, smashing into the newly painted drywall, dropping to the floor with a cracked screen. She didn't want a balanced ledger. She wanted the friction. She wanted the sawdust. She wanted the man who looked at her broken foundation and saw a load-bearing wall. The address was in a neighborhood Victoria's driver actively tried to avoid. It was an industrial district that had slowly surrendered to cheap residential zoning. Brick warehouses with blown-out windows sat next to squat, gray apartment blocks. The sidewalks were a minefield of cracked concrete, overgrown weeds, and discarded trash. Victoria's customized black SUV idled at the curb. The ramp deployed with a smooth, hydraulic hiss, lowering onto a patch of uneven pavement. "Ms. Hayes, are you sure about this?" Her driver, Thomas, asked, his eyes scanning the street nervously through the rearview mirror. "I can go up and deliver whatever message you have." "I'm perfectly capable, Thomas. Keep the engine running," Victoria said. She rolled down the ramp and hit the pavement. Immediately, the reality of Arturo's world rattled through her spine. The shocks on her chair were built for smooth marble and corporate carpets, not the violently jagged terrain of a neglected city sidewalk. Every crack sent a jolt into her lower back. She navigated a block and a half, weaving around a rusted shopping cart and a pile of damp cardboard, until she reached the address listed on his company invoice. It was a 4-story brick building that looked tired. Paint peeled from the window frames like a bad sunburn. Victoria approached the entrance. Her jaw tightened. There were 3 concrete steps leading to the heavy glass door. Beside the steps, someone had installed a metal ramp. It was a terrifying piece of civic neglect. It was rusted, incredibly steep, and lacked any sort of handrail on the right side. It didn't meet a single ADA code in existence. She stared at it. The sheer, brutal unfairness of the built world pressed down on her. In her mansion, Arturo had built her a sweeping, perfectly graded masterpiece. Here, in his reality, he lived behind a rusted barricade that told people like her they didn't belong. She gripped the joystick. She leaned her torso forward, shifting her center of gravity to prevent the heavy chair from tipping backward, and pushed the speed to maximum. The motors roared. The chair hit the metal ramp with a violent clang. The wheels spun for a fraction of a second on a patch of rust, searching for traction before biting hard. Victoria flew up the steep incline, her teeth rattling in her skull, and slammed to a halt on the tiny concrete landing just before the door. She exhaled a shaky breath, her hands trembling. She keyed the buzzer for apartment 3B. Static crackled through the ancient speaker. "Yeah? Who is it?" Arturo's voice was distorted, tired. "Open the damn door, Arturo," Victoria said. The static went dead. 10 agonizing seconds passed. Then, the heavy lock buzzed with a loud, angry rattle. Victoria pushed the door open and rolled into the lobby. It smelled heavily of bleach, old cooking oil, and damp wool. The elevator was a claustrophobic box with scratched metal walls. She barely fit. She had to back in, scraping her footrests against the sliding doors. When the doors opened on the 3rd floor, Arturo was standing in the hallway. He was wearing faded gray sweatpants and a white t-shirt stained with tomato sauce. He held a dish towel in one hand. His hair was a mess. He looked completely and utterly disarmed. He stared at the titanium wheelchair, taking up nearly the entire width of his narrow hallway. He looked at Victoria, in her tailored slacks and a silk blouse, looking like a diamond dropped in a dirty ashtray. "What are you doing here?" he breathed, the aggression completely drained from his voice, replaced by pure shock. "You did the trim work on the east window wrong," Victoria lied smoothly, her voice echoing in the cheap plaster hallway. Arturo blinked. "No, I didn't. I laser-leveled that trim myself. It's off by 1/4 of an inch. It's hideous. I need you to fix it." "Victoria, You didn't drive across the city and climb that death trap ramp out front to tell me a piece of trim is off by a fraction of an inch." "No," she agreed, her gray eyes locking onto his. "I came because you are a coward." Arturo flinched. He tightened his grip on the dish towel, his knuckles going white. "I told you the job is— If you say the job is done one more time, I will run over your foot," Victoria interrupted, her voice rising, shedding its corporate control. "I didn't come here for the carpenter, Arturo. I came for the man who had the nerve to look a billionaire in the face and tell her she was being stupid about a ladder." Arturo leaned back against the wall of the hallway. The fight was bleeding out of him. He ran a hand over his face. "You shouldn't be here." "Why? Because it's dirty? Because the elevator smells?" Victoria pushed her chair forward, closing the distance until she was inches from him. "You stood in my house and accused me of emasculating you. You accused me of using my wealth to shield you from reality. But that wasn't it at all, was it?" Arturo looked away, staring at a water stain on the ceiling. "You didn't walk away because I defended you against Richard," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a softer, more dangerous register. "You walked away because for a split second, you forgot the tax brackets, you forgot the rules. And when Richard reminded you, you panicked. You realized you were actually starting to care about the woman in the chair, and it terrified you." "Of course it terrified me," Arturo finally snapped, his voice rough, tearing through the quiet hallway. He pushed off the wall, towering over her, his chest heaving. "Look around you, Victoria. Look at this place." He gestured wildly to the peeling wallpaper, the flickering fluorescent light overhead, the worn carpet. "My wife left me because I couldn't provide enough," Arturo said, the old, bitter wound cracking wide open. "She wanted vacations and nice cars, and I gave her a 2-bedroom walk-up and a mountain of medical debt from a difficult birth. I swing a hammer for a living. I smell like sawdust and sweat. You move markets. You own fleets of ships. You drink coffee out of cups that cost more than my weekly grocery budget." He dropped his arms, his shoulders slumping. The anger vanished, leaving only a profound, exhausting sadness. "What the hell am I supposed to offer you?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I can't take care of you, Victoria. I can't be the guy who fixes your life." Victoria sat perfectly still. The silence hung between them, heavy and raw. She looked at his calloused hands. She looked at the exhaustion etched deep into the corners of his eyes. "Arturo," she said quietly, "look at me." He slowly brought his gaze back to hers. "I don't need you to fix my life," Victoria said, her voice steady, stripped of all pretense. "I have people who fix things. I have doctors. I have physical therapists. I have an army of lawyers and accountants. I can buy anything on this earth. Do you know what I can't buy?" He didn't answer. "Gravity," she whispered. She reached out. She took his large, scarred hand in hers. Her fingers were cool and smooth. His were rough and warm. "Everyone in my life treats me like I'm fragile," Victoria said, her thumb tracing the deep callus on his palm. "They tiptoe. They apologize for stares. They pity me. You never did. You saw the broken foundation, and you just built a better support structure. You didn't baby me, you pushed me. You're the only person who demands I stand on my own 2 feet, even when I can't." Arturo swallowed hard, his throat tight. He looked down at their joined hands. "You think you have nothing to offer me?" Victoria asked, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "You gave me the only room in my entire house where I feel like a human being. You gave me a cup of terrible coffee that tasted like freedom. You gave me the truth." The hallway door creaked open. Chloe peeked her head out. She was wearing mismatched pajamas, a dab of red pasta sauce on her chin. She looked at Arturo, then her eyes darted down to the wheelchair. Her face instantly lit up with the blinding, uncomplicated joy of a child. "You brought the wheels!" Chloe yelled, shoving the door wide open and running out into the hallway. Arturo hurriedly let go of Victoria's hand, a sudden flush creeping up his neck. Victoria laughed. It was the same rusty, unused laugh she had let out in the dust of the library weeks ago, but this time it was louder, echoing off the cheap plaster walls. "I did bring the wheels, Chloe," Victoria said, shifting her attention to the little girl. "Though your ramp downstairs needs some serious engineering help. It's a structural nightmare." "I told Dad that," Chloe said proudly. "I told him the angle of incidence was too high. He told me to stop using big words to insult his apartment." Arturo groaned, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I'm raising a monster, a tiny, arrogant monster." "She's brilliant," Victoria corrected. She looked back up at Arturo. The humor faded from her eyes, replaced by a quiet, fierce determination. "I fired Richard today." Arturo froze. "You what?" "I bought out his shares. I forced him off the board. It cost me an obscene amount of money, and my legal team is having a collective aneurysm." "Victoria, you didn't have to do that for me," Arturo said, the panic rising in his chest again. "I didn't do it for you," Victoria said sharply. "I did it for me. Because I realized I don't want people in my life who look down on the people I respect. I'm cleaning house. I'm fixing my own foundation." She backed her chair up slightly, creating an inch of space between them. "I don't know how this works, Arturo," Victoria said, her voice dropping, laying her cards on the table. "I don't know how we bridge the gap between your world and mine. I don't know how to do this without my money making you feel small. And I don't know how to do this without my chair making things complicated. It's going to be messy. It's going to be an engineering nightmare." Arturo looked at her. He saw the brilliant, ruthless billionaire. He saw the woman whose legs betrayed her. He saw the person who had driven through the worst part of the city, climbed a rusted metal ramp, and forced her way into his cheap apartment just to call him a coward. He saw his equal. "I don't mind a mess," Arturo said slowly, a small, crooked smile finally breaking through the heavy lines of his face. "And I'm pretty good with engineering nightmares." He stepped forward. He didn't bend down to meet her at eye level. He stayed standing, forcing her to look up at him, maintaining the friction, maintaining the push and pull that made them work. "But I have rules," Arturo said, his tone turning serious. "I'm a CEO. I love rules," Victoria countered, crossing her arms. "1, Arturo ticked off a finger. "I pay for my own dinners. Even if we're eating street hot dogs because it's all I can afford, I buy my own food. 2, no pity for my bank account and no pity for your chair. We deal with the obstacles. We don't apologize for them. 3, he glanced down at Chloe, who was currently inspecting the LED battery indicator on Victoria's armrest. "If you ever try to give my daughter $100 pencils again, I will report you to Child Services for spoiling her." Victoria smirked. "The pencils stay. It's an investment in future architectural talent. The rest of the terms are acceptable." "Good," Arturo said. He reached out and hit the button for the elevator. The old machine groaned and began its slow descent to the lobby. "Are we leaving?" Victoria asked, confused. "I'm starving, and Chloe's mac and cheese is an insult to the culinary arts," Arturo said, grabbing a worn leather jacket off a hook by the door. "We're going to get pizza, a cheap, greasy pizza down the street. It has terrible lighting, the tables are sticky, and there are exactly 0 steps to get inside." Victoria looked at him. The tightness in her chest, the coil of anxiety that had been wrapped around her lungs for 5 years, suddenly went slack. "Lead the way, Mr. Miller," she said. Arturo walked out of the apartment, locking the door behind him. He walked alongside the wheelchair, not pushing it, not hovering, just matching her pace. They moved down the narrow hallway, the master carpenter and the billionaire CEO, navigating the uneven floor together. It wasn't a fairy tale. The gap between them was still massive. The friction would still be there tomorrow. There would be arguments about money, there would be medical crises, there would be the exhausting daily grind of navigating a world built for the able-bodied and the wealthy. But as the elevator doors slid open, Arturo looked down at Victoria, and Victoria looked up at him. They weren't ignoring the gap anymore. They were just finally ready to build a bridge across it. Sometimes, the strongest foundations aren't made of concrete and steel. They're built on raw honesty, mutual respect, and the willingness to meet someone exactly where they are, broken edges and all. Arturo and Victoria proved that love isn't about ignoring our differences. It's about rolling up our sleeves and building a bridge across them. If this story of smashing barriers and finding love against the odds moved you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that true strength lies in vulnerability, and subscribe for more deeply human stories. What would you build? Let me know below.